Hi there, I'm Keane. Welcome to Crikey's Political Wrap, the first one for 2012. Each month we're going to try and process the month in politics down into an easily digestible chunk of blancmange. Now, in January we saw another example of how it is in Australia that some multinational companies get to pick and choose what tax rate they pay. At the end of 2011, of course, the government managed to get through the House of Representatives its mining tax, which, as you might recall, was dictated to it by some UK and Swiss-based tax dodgers who happened to dig up a lot of our minerals. Well, in January things went one better. Manufacturing Minister and multiple winner, most aptly named politician Kim Carr, was dispatched to Detroit in order to negotiate with General Motors and Ford about how much money they'd like to get from taxpayers in order to keep making cars here. The package, which is worth over $100 million, has yet to be approved by Cabinet, which is going to be interesting because Kim Carr's actually no longer in Cabinet, having been knifed by Julia Gillard last December. Don't worry, Kim, she ends up doing that to a lot of people. Yet there he was, just over a month after being sacked from Cabinet, over in Detroit saving the government's bacon.
Take him to Detroit.
No! No, not Detroit! No! No, please! Anything but that! No!
Why? Well, apparently we love cars, although not really Australian cars. In fact, more accurately, we love car workers, because at the moment we're spending probably around $20,000 a year on their jobs, which is probably about $2,000 a year more than we give to the unemployed. Now, there's only about 50,000 car workers actually in Australia, and if you think that's a lot, well, that's about 5% of the entire manufacturing workforce, which these days is about 8% of the overall workforce. So we're really not talking about a very great number of people in the scheme of things. But for politicians, having a car industry is sort of like a form of economic hairy-chestedness. Tony Abbott, who claims to believe in free markets, actually went so far as to say that having a car industry is a sort of an emblem of having a first world economy, which must come as quite a shock to countries like New Zealand and Austria and Norway and Denmark, none of which actually have a car industry, but which might have thought they had a first world economy. But the big policy issue in January, of course, involved a much more successful industry than manufacturing, gaming, with Julia Gillard walking away from her commitment to introduce mandatory pre-commitment technology for poker machines with Andrew Wilkie. A trial of the technology is actually a good idea, but it should have been the sort of thing that Julia Gillard promised Wilkie back in September 2010 when she signed an agreement for his support, an agreement that she's now walked away from. Now, savvy PR professionals might tell you that if you've got a bit of a problem with being seen to be walking away from your commitments all the time, it's probably not a good idea to actually go off and do that again if you want to try and remedy it. Being considered untrustworthy by voters isn't necessarily a terminal political condition. I mean, to take two examples, John Howard and Richard Nixon both spent much of their time in public life being the sort of people that voters wouldn't trust to sell them a used car. But they got the benefit of the doubt, I think, because voters tended to think that whatever deviousness they had tended to be used in relation to their core principles. What Julia Gillard's core principles are, voters have no idea. In fact, her own backbench probably has no idea. All that they seem to be able to work out is that her untrustworthiness is linked to her pursuit of power, and that's not a good look. Like a lot of things that happen under this government, walking away from Wilkie might have been politically smart, but it wasn't wise. Neither smart nor wise was the Prime Ministerial Media Advisor who decided on Australia Day to stir the pot about Tony Abbott's comments about the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Now, this is pretty straightforward stuff. It's what media advisors do all the time. You don't spend too long in a press gallery without a shadow minister's office or a minister's office or even the Prime Minister's office contacting you to make sure that you've noticed that their opponents have said something that they deem to be embarrassing. But in this case, the result was a media conflagration, from which virtually no one who was involved got out looking any good, particularly not the protesters who interrupted a ceremony designed to acknowledge bravery in order to demand that Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott come out and talk to them. Because that's how democracy is supposed to work, isn't it? Our nation's leaders at the beck and call of angry, uninformed protesters hammering on windows. The whole thing confirmed Julia Gillard's Saddam touch. Everything she touches turns to crap. an improbable act of political alchemy that's driven by an inability to distinguish what's smart. Well, what's smart if your political education consists of watching the West Wing and the thick of it, from what's wise. It wasn't quite January, but right at the end of December that we got yet another glimpse of how the Daily Telegraph, Australia's least trusted major metropolitan newspaper, carries on. The Australian Press Council issued a scathing report about a number of articles about the national broadband network that had appeared in the Telegraph, declaring that they were seriously misleading. You'll never guess, but the Telegraph waited until Boxing Day to run the correction, burying it so deep in the newspaper that you'd need Italian cave divers to find it. Of course, the Telegraph isn't interested in facts, it's mainly interested in its campaign against the government. And that's a campaign that's really going to ramp up later in the year when the carbon pricing package kicks in. It makes you wonder what it must be like being a Telegraph journalist. You've got a glass jaw, you've got a thin skin, you're conscious that the rest of your industry thinks that you're a rather unfunny joke. It must be a bit like writing for The Onion, except you're not really deliberately sending out to amuse. It's more like you're just publicly soiling yourself and blaming it on Julia Gillard. And the odd thing is, does anyone think that Julia Gillard really needs help in undermining her own leadership right at the moment? Well, that's all for now, but I'll be back in a few weeks when we'll look at what the always annoying month of February has brought us. Until then, watch the skies.
Take him to Detroit.
No! No, not Detroit! No!